If you are here listening to an old man sort through the quiet knots of his life, thank you. And if you wish to stay with me a little longer, feel free to let me know where you are listening from. It matters more than you might think to have someone sitting with me as I tell this story. My name is Adrian Cole, and whatever else I have been in this world, I have always tried to be a father first. Peace was my closest companion for many years. It lived in the slow boil of the kettle each morning, in the soft scrape of the blinds as I opened them just enough for the first line of daylight to rest on the floor, and in the methodical tick of the clocks I repaired as part of my small trade. Time has its own kind of mercy, and in those quiet hours, I believed it had finally granted me a gentle life. But peace is a thin thread, and you never notice the fraying until it snaps. My son, Martin, was the one thing I knew I had done right. I raised him alone after his mother left without much explanation. People like to pretend abandonment happens loudly, in slammed doors or shouted arguments, but most of the time it slips in quietly, the way seasons change. One day she was simply gone, and the silence that followed her departure settled into the corners of the house like dust. I never blamed her. Some people are shaped for staying, and some are shaped for leaving. I only made sure Martin never felt the tear she left behind. He grew into a man with a steady voice and a steady heart. There was a gentleness in him that seemed too rare for the world he lived in. He forgave easily. He listened before speaking. And when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that made it hard to remember all the years we had scraped by with very little. We had our small routines, Sunday breakfasts where we talked about nothing and everything, evening walks that slowed the noise of the world, repairs on the porch boards that were always a little crooked but in a way that felt like home. Life was simple, but it held together. Then Martin met Elena. He told me about her one evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, fingers tapping nervously against his mug. She was kind, thoughtful, bright. When he spoke of her, there was a new light in him, a softness that had not been there before. The weeks went on, and that glow only deepened. I watched him move differently, as though his steps were carrying him towards something he had not dared to imagine for himself. He was in love, unmistakably so. I will admit, I liked Elena the first few times we met. She had a warm voice and a way of looking directly at you, not past you. She brought flowers once, even though I had never mentioned liking them. But kindness is a fragile thing, easily bent by the hands that hold it, and soon enough, I discovered someone else stood behind her gentle smile. Her mother, Miranda Ward. I had seen confident people before, stern people, proud people, but Miranda carried something different. She entered a room like it was a stage, and every person present was an audience meant to admire her performance. Her eyes moved over you with the cool precision of someone assessing damage on a piece of furniture she did not wish to pay for. Every compliment she offered had a fine crack running through it. Every question was sharper than necessary. Still, I brushed it aside. Weddings, I told myself, soften even the hardest of tempers. And Martin looked so happy, so certain, that I wanted nothing more than to support him. The months passed in a blur of dress fittings, menu tastings, and endless decisions about colors, flowers, and seating arrangements. I am not a man of complicated tastes. If people can sit, eat, and leave wearing their shoes, I consider a celebration successful. But the Wards demanded perfection, and perfection is a demanding guest. Sometimes Miranda would pull me aside, her voice smooth and cool. "Perhaps it would be best if you let us handle the more delicate matters," she would say. As though the act of being polite was a task too refined for my hands, I held my tongue. Peace, after all, is often built from swallowed words. On the morning of the wedding, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the suit Martin had chosen for me, I felt something warm in my chest. Pride. Yes. Hope. Certainly. But also a quiet ache, the kind that reminds you that moments like this only come once. What I did not know was this. Before the day ended, before the sun had even slipped behind the horizon, one single sentence would break the world open, and nothing would ever be the same again. The months before the wedding unfolded in a way that still feels strange to recall. On the surface, everything appeared hopeful. Martin was radiant, more alive than I had seen him in years. He spoke of plans, of travel, of building a future with Elena in a small home they hoped to find after the ceremony. He had always been a dreamer in quiet ways, but now those dreams seemed to lace themselves into every thought, every gesture. I wanted to hold on to that happiness for him, protect it from the world's sharper corners. But joy is rarely a simple thing, and the closer we moved toward the wedding, the more I began to feel the pressure of an invisible hand against my back, urging me to notice the cracks I stubbornly ignored. Miranda Ward had a peculiar talent for criticism delivered with sweetness. She never raised her voice, never openly insulted me. Instead, she wrapped every remark in courtesy, so tight it felt suffocating. She would glance at my jacket and offer a gentle suggestion that a different cut might look more appropriate for a man of my background. She would comment on my posture, my shoes, my way of speaking, all under the guise of preparing me for a more refined audience. I reminded myself that some people confuse cruelty for sophistication. Still, something deeper tugged at me, something I hesitated to examine too closely. It began the afternoon. Miranda asked me a question about Martin's childhood. We had been reviewing a set of seating charts that seemed more complicated than any blueprint I had ever seen. Without looking up from her papers, she asked, almost casually, "When he was 8, how long did that illness last?" I felt the air still, as though the room paused to hear my answer. Martin's illness had been a private chapter of our lives, one I rarely revisited. He had suffered a severe infection that year and spent weeks in isolation under observation. It was a frightening time, and the memory of his small hands trembling as he fought for breath lingered long after he recovered. Only a handful of people knew how close we came to losing him. I certainly had never mentioned it to the Wards. I asked quietly, "How did you know about that?" Miranda lifted her eyes, expression unreadable, and said she assumed all parents had medical stories about their children. Then she resumed her arrangements as though the moment had never occurred. But the question echoed in my mind long after I left her house. It was not something she could have guessed, and it was not something Martin would have mentioned. The unease settled into me like a splinter beneath the skin. The wedding preparations grew more intense as the weeks slipped by. There were rehearsals, fittings, flower selections, music tests, and endless decisions I had no business weighing in on. I tried to remain helpful, offering my hands where I could, but Miranda seemed intent on reminding me of my place in every interaction. She never said outright that she preferred I step aside, but her tone and choices said it for her. Elena changed too. The warmth she had shown me in the beginning dimmed, replaced with a nervousness that clung to her like a shadow. She laughed less. She spoke less. She followed Miranda's cues in every conversation. When I asked if she was nervous about the wedding, she smiled too quickly, a smile that did not reach her eyes, and said she was simply overwhelmed by the details. But the truth was more fragile than her explanation allowed. Martin did not notice the shift. Love softens the edges of what we would otherwise see clearly. He was too busy making sure everything was perfect, too wrapped in the excitement of building a life with someone he believed shared his heart completely. I did not want to pull him away from that happiness with my half-formed suspicions. Still, the tension was impossible to ignore. Miranda's relatives sometimes looked at me with a strange expression, as though they were trying to remember where they had seen me before. Once, one of her sisters leaned toward another and whispered something while glancing at me, their faces tightening. When I approached, they quickly smiled, overly polite. Weddings reveal truth in small ways. A glance held too long. A smile that stiffens at the edges. A question you never expected to hear. By the final week, even the air seemed charged with something unsaid. I tried not to burden Martin with my worries. He was happy, and a father will always choose to protect that joy when he can. But late in the night before the wedding, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, I felt a quiet certainty rise in me. Something was coming. Something I could not name yet, but it moved beneath the surface, like a current shifting under calm water. I told myself peace could hold through one more day. I was wrong. The morning of the wedding arrived with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. I woke before the alarm, though I had barely slept. The house was dim and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I stood for a long moment in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from the kettle, wondering if Martin was awake yet, wondering if the day would unfold with the gentleness he deserved. Hope can be a powerful thing, even when you know better. I dressed slowly, smoothing the suit jacket Martin had chosen for me. He insisted this was the one, saying it made me look dignified. The fabric felt unfamiliar against my skin, as though I were borrowing a version of myself I had not yet grown into. When I adjusted my tie in the mirror, I saw not an aging father, but a man doing his best to honor his son on the most important day of his life. I held on to that thought, ignoring the faint tremor in my hands. When I arrived at the venue, the sun had just slipped over the horizon, painting everything in a soft golden haze. The building itself stood tall and polished, a testament to the impeccable taste Miranda never hesitated to remind others she possessed. I stepped inside and was met with the buzz of preparation. Florists added final touches to centerpieces, servers arranged rows of glasses, and a pianist rehearsed a gentle melody that floated through the air like a whispered blessing. I found small tasks to help with, anything that made me feel useful. Straightening chairs, guiding a lost photographer to the dressing rooms, comforting a jittery ring bearer who was convinced he would forget his cue and ruin everything. There was life and laughter in the space, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the day might be kinder than the weeks that led to it. Then Miranda arrived. She moved across the room with a kind of rehearsed poise, every step measured, every gesture polished. Her eyes scanned the environment as though she were evaluating the worth of each person present. When her gaze settled on me, it lingered. Not long, but long enough to remind me that approval from her was a cliff I would never reach. "You are early, Mr. Cole," she said, offering a smile that held no warmth. I simply nodded. I preferred silence with her. Words were too easily twisted in her hands. Her attention shifted to the decorations, and she immediately began giving orders, adjusting small details that no one else would have noticed, criticizing imperfections that existed only in her imagination. I excused myself before she could redirect her scrutiny back to me. When I reached the main hall, I saw Martin standing near the altar, adjusting his cuffs with a nervous energy he was trying to hide. His face brightened when he saw me, and he came over at once. "Dad," he said quietly, "is everything all right?" "Always," I replied. And I meant it. Seeing him in that moment was enough to steady me. He looked strong, hopeful, ready for the life he believed he was stepping into. He took a breath and glanced at the doors where Elena would soon walk through. There was a softness in his eyes that reminded me of the days he used to run ahead of me on forest trails, always eager to see what waited around the bend. I wished I could freeze that expression, keep it untouched by what was coming. The ceremony began shortly after. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, scattering colors over the walls like pieces of stained glass drifting in the air. Guests rose, music swelled, and Elena appeared at the entrance. She looked radiant, a vision of grace and fragile hope. But there was something strange in her expression. The smile she wore trembled at the edges, and her eyes flicked toward her mother more often than toward the man she was walking toward. Miranda watched from her seat with a rigid posture, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze shifted between Elena and me in a way that made my pulse quicken. There was something there, something calculated. As the ceremony unfolded, the beauty of it all brushed against me, but could not settle. A strange tension hovered in the air, faint but unmistakable. At one point, I caught one of Miranda's cousins staring at me with the kind of intensity that burns through politeness. When our eyes met, he looked away too quickly, whispering something to the man beside him. The unease that had followed me for months returned with full weight. Still, I stood firm. I watched my son speak his vows, watched his hands tremble only slightly, watched love fill him from the inside out. And I prayed silently that whatever shadows lingered at the edges would not touch him. But shadows do not respect prayer. They move where they please. After the ceremony ended, guests spilled into the reception hall, laughter rising like bright threads in the air. The room glowed with soft lights, the music was gentle, and for a moment, everything felt as though it might hold steady. I did not know then that the storm had already entered the room, wearing sequins and a smile sharpened by years of practiced cruelty. And soon, it would tear the world open. The reception hall shimmered with soft light, the kind that makes everything appear gentler than it truly is. Crystal glasses caught the glow from the chandeliers, scattering it across the room in tiny sparks. Laughter drifted from table to table, blending with the mellow hum of music. People often forget that beauty can exist in the minutes before a storm, that calm can sit quietly beside disaster without either acknowledging the other. I found my seat at a round table near the front, close enough to see Martin and Elena greeting guests, yet far enough to avoid the attention I had grown accustomed to dodging. The tablecloth beneath my palms felt smooth, cool, something steady to anchor myself with. For a brief moment, the weight in my chest eased. Martin looked happy, so deeply, sincerely happy. He moved through the crowd with a gentleness that drew people toward him. Elena clung to his arm, her smile bright but fragile, like a glass ornament held too tightly. She kept glancing at her mother, who sat rigidly at the head table, watching everything with a gaze sharp enough to cut through silk. Then it began. I noticed the shift first in the music. It softened, as though the air itself had decided to listen. The murmured conversation slowed, then stilled, altogether. A delicate tap echoed across the room. Once, twice, a third time. Miranda Ward stood. Her sequin dress caught the light in fractured bursts, sharp as broken glass. She held her champagne flute with perfect posture, her smile polished to a shine that did not reach her eyes. The entire room quieted, not out of respect, but out of instinct. People sense danger, even when it wears perfume. "Thank you all for joining us today," she began, her voice smooth as a practice line from a well-rehearsed play. "Today we celebrate not just a union of love, but the merging of two families. Safe, agreeable words, words that meant nothing." But her eyes drifted across the hall with slow deliberation, resting finally, inevitably, on me. "And of course," she continued, "every family has its history, some more admirable than others." A faint ripple of unease moved through the room. Elena stiffened beside Martin. He squeezed her hand, perhaps to steady her, perhaps to steady himself. I sat still, spine straight, breath controlled. Miranda lifted her glass a little higher. Her smile widened, brittle and gleaming. "We are honored to welcome everyone here today, even those whose presence is unexpected." There it was, the first drop of venom. A cousin of hers looked at me sharply, recognition flickering in his eyes. I felt the room tilt slightly, as though the floor had softened. And then she said it. "That," she declared lightly, gesturing toward me with the grace of someone pointing out a stain, "is not a father." Her voice brightened as though she were delivering a punchline. "That is a mistake dressed for the occasion." Silence did not fall. It collapsed. The air thickened. The music cut off mid-note. Somewhere in the back of the room, a fork slipped from someone's fingers and clattered against a plate. Heat flooded my neck, rising slowly to my cheeks. But pain does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moves quietly, settling deep in places no one can see. Then, the blow that cut deeper than the insult. Elena laughed. Not a soft, embarrassed laugh. Not a gasp. Not a stifled sound of discomfort. A real laugh, open, clear, shared with her mother as though they had rehearsed it. The room recoiled. Even those who wished to remain neutral could not hide their shock. I lowered my eyes to my hands beneath the table. My fingers trembled. I hid them in my lap and held still. Pride can be a heavy coat, but in moments like this, it becomes armor, the only thing keeping a man upright. Miranda placed her glass down with a quiet tap, satisfied, like someone dusting off her hands after completing a task. She leaned toward Elena, whispering something that tightened the smile on her daughter's face. A small fracture formed inside me. Not a loud breaking, but a quiet shift, the kind that changes the shape of a man from the inside. Before I could gather my breath, I saw movement at the head table. Martin stood. Not abruptly, not with theatrics. He rose with a steadiness that belonged to a man who has reached a line inside himself and refuses to let anyone cross it. He looked at Elena first. The betrayal in his eyes was so raw it felt like watching a branch snap under too much weight. Then he looked at Miranda, and finally, at me. When he spoke, his voice was calm, unshaken. "If you cannot respect my father," he said, "then you cannot respect me." The words echoed across the hall, unadorned, unwavering, and devastating. "This wedding is over." A collective gasp surged through the room. Elena's smile shattered. Miranda's breath caught sharply. Guests froze, mouths half open, and Martin turned. He walked out. No hesitation, no apology, no glance backward. Straight, fast, as though the only air he could breathe was outside the building. The hall erupted into panic behind him, voices rising like a broken orchestra. But I remained still, breathing quietly, sitting in the eye of the storm. Inside me, something powerful and calm took root. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The hall did not empty as quickly as one might imagine. People rarely know how to leave a disaster. Some stood frozen, whispering into their palms. Others hovered near the exits, unsure whether staying made them complicit or leaving made them cowardly. And a few simply stared at me, their eyes wide with pity or confusion or a discomfort they did not know how to mask. I remained in my chair, hands folded in my lap, as though stillness might protect me from the shards of humiliation scattered across the floor. Miranda moved first. She swept from table to table, her voice clipped, brittle. She insisted Martin was overwhelmed, that he would come to his senses, that I had somehow coerced him into this display. Her tone made it sound as though she were rearranging furniture rather than trying to salvage the ruins of her daughter's wedding. Elena sat near the head table, shoulders shaking, crying into the hands of a friend. But even in her tears, there was something missing. Not remorse, not understanding, something else, something hollow. Her grief was for the spectacle, not the wound she had helped inflict. I watched them through a haze, feeling detached, as though I were observing a scene from behind glass. Pain has a way of creating distance. You sit in your own body, but everything feels foreign. A gentle hand touched my shoulder. My sister, who had arrived quietly that morning, leaned close and whispered, "You did nothing wrong. None of this is on you." I nodded, though the nod felt weak, empty. Words of comfort rarely take root when humiliation is still fresh. Eventually, one by one, guests began to leave. Some offered awkward nods. Others murmured apologies or condolences. A few placed their hands briefly on mine, their touch warm and fleeting, like leaves brushing against a window before falling away. When the hall was nearly empty, I stood. My knees protested, stiff from holding so much stillness. I looked around once, trying to mark the moment so I could later make sense of it. But some moments refuse meaning. Outside, the night air greeted me like a balm. Cool, honest, free of the chaos still buzzing behind the reception doors. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle into my chest. It had always been my refuge. Silence. Tonight it felt sacred. When I reached home, the house held the weight of all the years Martin and I had spent there. The kitchen chair, where he colored pictures as a child. The hallway, where he learned to tie his shoes. The porch he helped me repair plank by crooked plank. Every memory felt sharper now. Every detail laced with the ache of the evening. I loosened my tie and draped it over the back of the chair. It slipped from my hands like a tired sigh. I poured a glass of water, not to drink, but to feel something cool and steady between my palms. I sat at the table, staring at the wood grain as though it might speak. My thoughts twisted in circles. Maybe I should not have gone. Maybe they were right. Maybe I embarrassed him. Maybe, but beneath the cruel murmurs of humiliation, another memory stirred. Martin, at 9 years old, sitting beside me on the porch, steps after a classmate mocked him. He had not cried loudly. His shoulders had simply trembled in that quiet, brave way children do when they do not want to be seen hurting. I remember placing my arm around him and saying, "You never let anyone tell you your worth. Not ever." The truth of that memory softened something inside me. Hours passed before I finally heard the front door open. The steps were familiar, slow, tired. Then Martin appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, hair disheveled, suit wrinkled, his face heavy with a sorrow no young man should carry. "Dad," he whispered, "I am sorry." I looked up, meeting his eyes. "For what?" He sank into the chair across from me, the same chair he had filled thousands of times growing up. "Because I let it happen," he said. "Because she laughed at you. Because I brought you there." His voice broke on the last word. I reached across the table and placed a hand on his arm. "You stopped it," I said. "That is all that matters." We sat in silence, the kind that belongs only to people who share a deep, unspoken grief. After a long moment, he lifted his head. "Tomorrow, I am going back," he said. "I am giving the ring back. And I am telling them exactly why." For a moment, I wanted to stop him, shield him, protect him from the wounds waiting on the other side of that decision. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw resolve forged in pain and clarity. "If that is what your heart needs," I said softly, "then do it." He stood and leaned down, pulling me into a tight embrace. "You deserve better," he murmured, his voice breaking again. "So much better." When he finally went upstairs, I remained at the table, letting his words echo through me. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, something old and heavy shifted in me. I did not speak their names. I did not curse them. But I began to think, carefully, because humiliation is not the end. Sometimes it is the door to something far bigger. Morning arrived reluctantly, slipping through the blinds in thin gray ribbons as though even the sun hesitated to touch the house after what had happened. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I had not slept much. My thoughts moved in slow circles, heavy and deliberate, like gears turning in an old clock. Martin had left early. He stepped out with a quiet determination I had only seen in him a handful of times in his life. Moments where he decided something in his heart, and nothing in the world could move him from it. Today he was returning the ring to the wards. Today he was ending everything completely. On the counter, he had left a small note in his hurried handwriting. "I have to do this." I folded it gently and slipped it into my pocket. A reminder not of the wedding that fell apart, but of the man my son had become. I sat alone in the stillness for a long time, before I finally rose and opened the drawer beside me. Inside was a small notebook, worn from years of grocery lists, repair notes, and thoughts I never wanted to lose. Today, it would serve a different purpose. I clicked the pen and began to write. Not anger, not accusations, just truth. I wrote down every moment I had allowed myself to be diminished. Every instance I had stayed silent for the sake of keeping peace. Every subtle dismissal, every measured insult, every moment when Miranda tried to make me a ghost in my own son's life. I wrote them slowly, carefully, not to seek vengeance, but to reclaim parts of myself I had allowed others to take. When I finished listing the past, I turned to a clean page and wrote at the top, "What I will no longer accept." It was not a manifesto. It was a boundary, long overdue. Line by line, I rebuilt something inside myself that had been cracked. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, my breath came easier, steadier. Then a memory returned the question Miranda had asked weeks earlier about Martin's childhood illness, a question she had no right to know the answer to. And something deeper stirred. Before I could follow that thought, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Silence hummed through the line, followed by a strained whisper, rushed and trembling. "You need to protect your son. Watch the wards carefully. They are not who they pretend to be." My grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" But the caller continued, voice cracking. They are hiding something far worse than what you saw last night. Do not let him go back there alone. A click, then nothing. The call ended as abruptly as it began. I stared at the screen, the quiet of the house suddenly feeling alert, sharpened. The voice had been desperate, frightened, and whoever it was, they knew more than they should. I tried calling back, but the number had already been disconnected. The house seemed to breathe around me. Slow, heavy, watchful. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong long before the insult at the wedding. I felt it now with a clarity that settled cold in my chest. Hours later, just as dusk approached, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, weighted. Then the door opened, and Martin stepped inside. His face told the story before his words did. Exhaustion, disbelief, and something else. Something like grief for a life he thought he was building. He sank into the chair across from me. "It's done," he said softly. I gave the ring back. I nodded and waited. He rubbed a hand over his face. When I arrived, Miranda refused to even look at me. She sat in the corner with her sisters hovering around her, like she was preparing for a performance. "And Elena?" I asked. She was on the couch, sobbing. But it was strange. She kept saying she did not mean to hurt me, that she only laughed because her mother told her to. She kept reaching for me, but I could not. He stopped, swallowing hard. I could not go near her. He stared at the table, voice dropping lower. Miranda fainted. I looked up sharply. Fainted? He nodded, exhaling a tired, humorless breath, collapsed halfway through one of her sentences. Her sisters ran around, grabbing towels and water and whispering dramatically. But no one checked on Elena. Not even her father. Silence settled between us like fog. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There is something else, Dad." He paused, searching for the right words. One of Miranda's sisters slipped. She said Miranda had been keeping track of me for years, long before Elena and I ever met. The room grew very still. "Tracked you?" I repeated quietly. He nodded. "And she said Miranda found something back then. Something she thought made me unsuitable." A cold realization washed over me. The childhood illness, the medical file, the question she should not have known to ask. Their cruelty had not been impulsive. It had been planned. My son sat across from me, breathing through the weight of something neither of us had expected. And in that moment, we both understood. We were standing at the edge of something far larger than a ruined wedding. And whatever the wards were hiding had only begun to surface. In the hours that followed Martin's return, the house felt less like a home and more like a place holding its breath. Something unseen lingered in the corners, a presence woven from unanswered questions and warnings whispered through a disconnected phone line. I moved through the rooms quietly, listening to the faint ticking of the clocks I kept on the shelves. Their rhythm usually comforted me. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown. As Martin rested upstairs, I revisited the one thread that would not leave my mind. His childhood illness. Those weeks had carved themselves into my memory. The pale light of the hospital, the hum of machines, the silence of doctors exchanging worried glances. The day they told me someone had tried to access Martin's medical file without authorization. They never found out who it was. I had let it fade into the background of the years that followed, believing it was a clerical error, a harmless mistake. Now, it did not feel like a mistake at all. I sat at my desk and powered on the old computer I used for repair records. Then, I searched through documents I had stored from that time long ago. Notes, letters, hospital summaries. It took almost an hour before I found the line I had forgotten. Unauthorized attempt from an external clinic database. Origin unknown. But the town listed beside the clinic's address wasn't unknown. It was the town where the Ward family had lived for generations. My heart slowed. A coldness spread into my chest. This was no coincidence. This was intent. The knock at the front door startled me enough to make my hand slip. The pen dropped from my fingers and clattered onto the floor. I froze. The hour was late, and visitors rarely come at times like this. When I opened the door, a gust of cool air swept in, but no one was there. only an envelope resting on the doormat. My name was printed on the front, in handwriting I did not recognize. I hesitated before picking it up. The paper was thin, almost delicate. Inside, a single sheet. No signature, no greeting. Only one sentence, written in hurried strokes. The truth will destroy them before it ever harms you. I stared at the words until they blurred. Someone knew what was unfolding. Someone was watching, and someone wanted to warn me. Before I could process the message, I heard footsteps behind me. Martin had come downstairs, still wearing the same clothes from earlier. His hair damp from showering, but his eyes shadowed. "Dad," he said softly, "is everything all right?" I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. I did not want to worry him more than he already was. "Get your coat," I said gently. "We are going out." He frowned. "Now?" "Yes. There is someone I need to speak to." The drive was quiet. The road stretched ahead of us, dimly lit, lined with trees that leaned over the pavement like silent sentinels. I could feel Martin watching me from the corner of his eye, but he did not ask questions. He trusted me. That trust felt heavier than anything Miranda or Elena had done. We arrived at a modest house on the edge of town. The lights were on, which gave me hope. When I knocked, the door opened to reveal a woman I recognized faintly. Her name was Carol, the nurse who had tended to Martin during his illness years ago. She blinked in surprise. "Mr. Cole?" I nodded. "I am sorry to bother you at this hour, but I need to ask something important." Her expression shifted, as though she had been expecting this visit for years. She stepped aside. "Please, come in." The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. A clock on the wall ticked faintly, oddly comforting. Carol motioned for us to sit, but my nerves made it impossible. "Someone tried to access my son's medical file when he was a child," I said. "You were the one who alerted the doctor. Do you remember anything more?" She hesitated, glancing toward Martin before looking back at me. "Yes," she said quietly. "More than I was allowed to say." I felt the room tilt around me. She continued, her voice heavy. "The attempt came from a clinic, used by a private family, the Wards. They were involved in a medical case back then, something with financial implications and a potential investigation. We never knew why they wanted Martin's file, but the hospital received pressure to ignore it. The matter was buried." My breath stilled. Martin sank into a chair, stunned. "Why? Why would they take interest in my file?" he whispered. Carol shook her head. "I do not know. But someone in that family feared something being exposed, and they believed your father held a connection to it." There it was, the shadow behind all the polished smiles. The reason Miranda's cruelty felt rehearsed, sharpened, intentional. I stood silent, letting truth unfurl its cold branches. Carol continued, lowering her voice. "You need to be careful. That family protects its secrets, and they do not care who they hurt in the process." We thanked her and stepped back into the night, the wind brushing past us like a whispered warning. In the car, Martin stared at the dashboard, his voice barely a breath. "Dad, they knew about me. Long before I ever met Elena. They watched us." "Yes," I said, "and when they could not control us, they tried to destroy us." He exhaled slowly, the truth settling into him like a weight he was finally strong enough to carry. We drove home in silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of revelation. The kind that rearranges your understanding of everything you thought you knew. As we walked up the steps, Martin paused. "What do we do now?" he asked. I looked at him, at the son I had raised, at the man he had become. "Now," I said quietly, "we let the truth unravel them, and we stand where we belong with dignity unbroken." Morning returned with a clarity that felt almost intrusive, a light that did not ask permission before touching every corner of the house. I sat on the porch with a cup of warm tea, watching the world wake at its own slow pace. Birds pecked at the feeder. Leaves rustled. A soft wind brushed against the railing. For the first time in days, my breathing settled into something close to steady. Inside, Martin remained quiet. He moved through the rooms with a thoughtful heaviness. not broken but reshaped. The truth we uncovered had not crushed him. It had carved him into someone stronger, more certain of who he was and who he would never allow into his life again. I sensed that what happened at the wedding was no longer the wound it had been. It was becoming something else, a threshold he had crossed. Later that afternoon, messages began arriving. Not from the guests who had attended, but from people connected to the Ward family. Some names I recognized. Others were strangers. The theme was always the same. Things were falling apart. One message read, "Miranda's sisters are arguing." Another, "Elena's father has left the house." A third, "They are blaming each other." I did not reply to any of them. Truth has a way of doing its own work. By evening, the house felt too quiet. Not the suffocating quiet of humiliation, but a deeper quiet, a steady one. I stepped outside to sweep the porch, more out of habit than necessity. The wind carried faint echoes from distant houses, children playing, a dog barking, the soft hum of a lawnmower shutting off. Life happening all at once, without waiting for permission. Martin joined me, leaning against the railing, hands in his pockets. "I went for a drive," he said. "I needed to think." "Did it help?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. I kept thinking about how I felt sitting in that hall, watching them laugh at you. I kept wondering how I let myself ignore all the signs." "You were in love," I said. "That is not a flaw." He looked down at the boards beneath us, each plank familiar in its crookedness. The porch had always been imperfect, but it held. Maybe that was the lesson he needed to remember. After a moment, he said, "Do you think they will come after us again?" The question hung there between us, soft and sharp at once. "I doubt it," I answered honestly. The thing about people who build their lives on image is that once the mirror cracks, they spend all their time trying to hide the pieces. Martin gave a small exhale, something like relief mixed with sorrow. We stood there in silence, watching the sky shift from pale blue to the warm amber of evening. It felt like the world itself was letting out a long breath. The next day, I received a call not from a blocked number, not from anyone mysterious, but from someone I had not heard from in years. A retired administrator from the old clinic where Martin had been treated. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Mr. Cole, I thought you should know. The investigation you asked about years ago, the one involving unauthorized access? Records show there were multiple attempts, all tied to the Ward family." She paused. "They were involved in a case of medical fraud. It never reached the courts. But it was close. Too close. Someone feared that information connected them to another patient from that same year. They must have believed your son's file held something they could use, or something that could expose them." My hand tightened around the phone. "Why tell me this now?" I asked. "Because," she said softly, "it seems the truth is surfacing on its own. And you deserve to understand what they tried to do." When I hung up, a strange calm washed over me. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. Steadier. Knowing the truth did not erase the pain, but it placed the burden where it belonged, on the shoulders of the ones who had created it. In the following days, I heard nothing more from the Wards. No calls. No apologies. No attempts to twist the story. Silence can be a weapon. But sometimes it becomes a confession. Martin began to heal, slowly but surely. He spent more time outside, returned to his hobbies, and even started speaking about the future again. Not with haste, but with sincerity. Watching him rebuild himself made something in me loosen, as though the knot in my chest had finally begun to untangle. One evening, he brought 2 mugs of tea to the porch and sat beside me. "Dad," he said quietly, "thank you for everything." "You have nothing to thank me for," I replied. He shook his head. "You taught me dignity. You stood tall even when they tried to take it from you. I saw who I want to be because of who you are." The words settled deep inside me, deeper than any insult ever could. We watched the sun sink beyond the trees, painting the sky in muted gold. The world softened into dusk, steady and unhurried, and I found myself speaking aloud the truth that had been forming inside me for days. "Respect is the foundation of everything," I said. Without it, even the grandest home collapses. Without it, even love becomes a weapon. But with it, a father and son can withstand anything. Martin nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. And with that, the story that began in humiliation ended in something far stronger. A reclaimed peace, a restored dignity, and a bond that no cruelty could break.